Hello and welcome to Muse Jam Session Recording 215. My name is Dani Beaumont, and this week I'm actually joining you from the San Francisco Adobe office. It's kind of unusual for me. I moved to the East Coast a few months back, but I'm excited to be back in the fold for the week and thought we would do our jam session from here. As usual, if you're watching me on Facebook, go ahead and put any questions you have for this session in the comments field of the Facebook live session. If you're also on Zoom, you're welcome to put it into chat. This is part 2 of a 2-part series. I used to be able to squeeze Adobe Muse 101 into an hour, but honestly, as we added things like responsive design, it got a little overwhelming. So this is the second part in the series. If you're watching the recording on YouTube, there is also another part to this that you can skip back and watch the first half, but we are going to kind of pick up where we left off from 2 weeks ago. So we are building out a pretty basic website. It's the starter design called Kava, and I will actually give you a little bit of background on that. If you are new to Muse and you want to go through some of the same steps I'm going through and work with some of the same assets, you can do that by going to the Muse microsite. So if you go to muse.adobe.com, it's kind of a website that the Muse team maintains directly. We use it as kind of a playground to show off new techniques. The landing page does that for us. But on the tutorial section of the site, if you scroll on down, there are some starter designs. And we're using the Kava responsive design as sort of a goal as we build out this site from scratch. So where I left off, let's kind of look back a little bit on where we were 2 weeks ago, is we had built out some of the basic, not too amazing looking right now, but the basic aspects of the Muse site design. So just to kind of refresh my own memory, if not anything else, we have 2 different master pages here. There's a landing page that basically has navigation on the top of the page. And then there's a second page, the interior pages that have the ability to have footer content. So we built that out. I have somewhat of a background here that's just there to allow me to see the white type on the back black area there. I'm going to scoot over here and just check something. I've got Kava spelled wrong, which is now bugging me. I have struggled with this for a long time. K-A-H-V-E, and I still get it wrong. K-A-H-V-E, no, that's correct. All right. But here back in the main site, there are 2 kind of chunks to the layout of pages within Muse. You'll notice towards the bottom here, I have master pages, and that's where I've defined that header and footer content so far. And then we began to build out the landing page. So the first page that folks see when they come to the site. And if I double click in there, we did a few things. We have the Kava logo, which is being populated from that master content. We also have a widget here, which is a dynamic menu widget, and that is also on a master page. It's automatically generating page navigation based on the site plan. So if I go back to the main part of my site here, I can do that by clicking on plan mode or just clicking on the main name of the project, the site that I'm working on. You'll see I have pages here, landing, menu, location, and reservation. That's reflected in the navigation at the side. But one of the things we did together is I showed you how you can include pages in a site that aren't necessarily in the navigation. So by right-clicking here, I excluded it from the dynamic menu, so the word landing does not appear in that menu. And then the other thing that I did was to come on into the Kava logo. So if I go back out to my main master, notice that interior here is inheriting all of the content from the landing area. And if I jump to our largest breakpoint, that Kava logo, when I click on it, it is allowing you to navigate back to the home page from anywhere else in the site, but the menu is not reflecting that. All right, as I mentioned, if this is all new to you, swing on back to the YouTube channel and you can scrub through the steps that I went through at that point. Just to kind of talk about, well, we already talked about some of the logistics. As I mentioned, I'm going to keep an eye on chat. If you have questions as we go along, please throw it into the chat pod there on Facebook Live. And I'm going to slow things down a little bit because I've been hanging around with Muse for about, I don't know, about 6 years at this point. If you're new to Muse, you have not been doing it as long. So slowing it down a bit, let's talk about the basics a little bit more. I'm going to hit a keyboard command or Control M, which takes me back to my site plan. And let's just now think about some of the next elements that we want to add to the page. We've got our basic navigation in place. We've got our basic master pages defined. Another thing that I did to just allow us to kind of mentally keep track of all of our elements is I worked with the layers in our design. If you've used Adobe products in the past, things like Illustrator, InDesign, Photoshop, one of my favorite sayings is standards, I love them. There's so many to choose from. So often people will say, I love the Adobe Creative Cloud experience, but I really wish this application would work like the way Adobe should. The funny thing is that we do align our workflows to a great extent between applications, but standards, I love them. There's so many to choose from. Muse is built by many of the same folks that built InDesign. So a lot of the paradigms that we use in Muse were leveraging the paradigms of InDesign. We also leverage some paradigms from Illustrator and Photoshop, of course. So if I come in and open up the Layers panel, similar to other applications you might use, we have this hierarchical structure. And I've broken out my Layers panel in groups here, and it's really a hierarchical stacking order for me. So the way I use layers is they shoot across all the pages, and anything I might have in that top layer will sit on top of all of the content. Because Muse allows you to both have fluid breakpoints, which determine how content resizes, what appears and doesn't appear based on the width of a browser, which usually corresponds to the device on which you're working, if that makes any sense. When I'm in a larger breakpoint for a desktop, content is controlled. Smaller breakpoint on something like a phone, I can have different behaviors and different content. I handle that across pages with breakpoints, as I mentioned. What I want to do here is look at the stacking order of my content. So I've got, for example, a section here for top navigation. I can hide and show that top nav. I have page content that's been defined. There's nothing really on a master page right now that would reflect the page content. And then there's footer content that sits below it. All right, it looks like I got a quick comment in chat. I'm going to look at that. So I've got one comment from Cabrina. I believe she could not get the layer hierarchy to move. I use layers, so I couldn't understand why I couldn't reorder. You can do the reordering, but perhaps it's a bit tricky as you play with it. So when I come in, let's say I want to add a new layer and I want to put it even below the footer. When I come in to add that new layer, by default, it starts at the top. A lot of times I just am lazy and I put my footer content first and then add page and top. If I come in and give this a name, we'll call it nothing. What she's suggesting is that it's hard to move these around. You can come in and press and drag. See if I can do this. Now that I'm calling on it, I can drag it. Notice that I get these drag lines. That should allow you to reorder your layer sets globally across all pages, but it is a bit tricky. So I'm just selecting one and pressing and dragging until I see that line indicating where I can drop that nothing layer that I'll now delete. So I would suggest, I don't know if you're on Mac or Windows, but it's a bit tricky. You do want to press and drag, and it will allow you to relayer the content. So now that I have those kind of blocking bits in mind, looks like I've got a quick response here. Just take a look. Sure. Yeah, no problem. So she's going to give that another try. While we're at it, and my train of thought tends to be a simple train, let me go ahead and look at the Facebook Live area. Looks like most folks are happy and in a good place. I'm happy to be here. I love doing these jam sessions. And because I'm usually talking to myself in a room, I love the feedback. So thanks for the good hellos. I really appreciate it. Okay. All right. Simple train of thought. So what we want to do now is start to build out some of the other pages. And in doing so, there's going to be a basic breakdown of content. There's going to be images. There's going to be text. We're going to work with the breakpoints that we've defined. And I want to build out these pages, but I want to make sure you understand some of the basic techniques around responsive design, breakpoints, widgets, and the ability to apply styles to those elements. So that's going to be my goal for this next 50 minutes, maybe 47, as we go along. So I'm going to go back out to my site plan again, and we're going to focus next on the menu aspect of the site. So I'll go back out to the live instance of this site, and we'll take a look at the design. So here in the Kava layout, you may notice that if you click on the starter design there within the Muse tutorial section, it comes with these cute little, you may think they're cute or annoying, but these cute little flyouts in the preview. These include short videos that I've recorded that very simply show a brand new user of Muse how you can change an existing template. So if you want to start with this template design and customize it just as an exercise for you to familiarize yourself with Muse, a great way to get started with that is to watch these individual videos around changes as you work. If we look at this menu page, there's a couple of things going on. So as I scroll down on the page, there's a header image here, the word Kava and the navigation on the right-hand side, as well as that header image. It's set to be scrolling, basically. So as I scroll down on the page, that content moves away. I can use different techniques, and maybe we'll play a little bit with things like parallax scrolling for the background image here in just a little bit. As we proceed down on the page, we have some simple text. Again, this is kind of just a starter design to show off the concept. So in the drink section, I have 3 columns, 3 tiles that have been defined. As I press and drag the edge of the browser, an interesting thing happens where, this is part of what you need to discern as a web designer. If you come from design but are new to the web, designing for this medium, there's things that we just start to keep in mind as we evaluate or plan out a design. So as I press and drag the edge of the browser, I use this little widget here in Chrome that lets me see what the current width of the browser is. And notice that as I'm pressing and dragging, the content is remaining centered on the page, but it's not resizing. So for example, long black with the price on the right, it's not resizing in width until I get to a particular breakpoint. So as I press and drag, it's probably about 1,200 pixels, if I'm not mistaken, where things start to change. So in that broader breakpoint, everything is set to what's known as fixed width, but it's centered on the page. As I press and drag, I get into a fluid width breakpoint. So the width of that long black tile is becoming more narrow until I get to the next breakpoint. And the rule within Muse is when your design is about to break, that's when you add a breakpoint. So when we're looking at active page content, we don't really advise you to say, hey, let's do a breakpoint for desktop, tablet, smartphone, all different devices and such, because there's so many on the market now. What you want to make sure is the experience of your viewer is always terrific, whether or not they're looking at a very large monitor or a very small smartphone device. So as I press and drag, I'm in this fluid breakpoint until my design's going to be about to break. So it's getting a little crowded, a little tall and skinny, and boom, I jump to that next breakpoint. Now notice everything kind of moved up on the page. Some users say, hey, Dani, y'all have a bug. I don't want things to jump up on the page. One of the things I do want to remind myself, and you'll probably need to remind your clients, is the intention behind responsive design in Muse is not to have sort of an animation experience as browser widths change. The intention is really for someone who is, let's say, on a tablet device and is coming to this page, when they hit that breakpoint, the content is optimized for the breakpoint. So we don't really animate between that first break and the second break, but we make sure that the content continues to look good. As I press and drag, I continue on a fluid breakpoint. I can tell that because the content is resizing in width until it gets a little crowded. And boom, we jump to the next breakpoint for tablet devices, and things become optimized for, let's say, not tablet, sorry. This is more smartphone class of devices. So if this was my iPhone 7 Plus, it would look pretty good. If it comes all the way down to a very small device at about, in this instance, 400 pixels in width, it still continues to look good. 320 is probably the most obscenely small breakpoint that you design for, and we kind of assume that in the smallest breakpoint, within Adobe Muse. So let's go in and just look at how we're setting up some of these elements on the page, starting with the background image, how that behaves, and then how I would define some of these tiles and work with them. I am going to do a little bit of cheating, a little Martha Stewart in the kitchen, and I'm going to grab some of these elements that are already created just to make things go a little quicker as we work. So here within the Muse application, I want to come to that menu page. And the first thing I want to do is look at that or think about that header content. So I'll zoom out a bit. Notice that a couple things are going on around breakpoints here. I have what the engineers called fangs, which is why we don't let the engineers market the product. But the fangs in the breakpoint bar are indicating breakpoints that are not on the current page that I'm looking at, but they are on the master page that is populating this page. So just as a means of explanation, I mentioned that breakpoints should be defined when your design content breaks on a page. What that is assuming is that you have all of the content on this page. Kind of the exception I would suggest to that rule is when you're defining navigation in the header area or the footer of your site. If you know that usually at about, let's say, 1200 or larger, people are using a desktop device to navigate your site. You know they're using a mouse, for example, to deal with the navigation here. If you jump to a smaller breakpoint, let's jump on in by pressing and dragging the breakpoint bar here. Notice I jumped to that next breakpoint, more for tablet classes of devices, and my navigation kind of becomes, doesn't look like I've done much to change that, but I could change this navigation now to better support a tablet device. Let's say I decided that people are using their finger now to navigate, and I don't want this to be too close. I can come in, I'm going to go back to my master pages, so hit Command M to go to the site plan and go into that master page that has the navigation. And here on the largest breakpoint, I've got that navigation element. I'm sorry this is white on gray, it's a little tough. But when I jump to the second one, as a designer, I want to consciously say, okay, what are people navigating my site with? Oh, maybe it's a touch device like a tablet. Perhaps I want to spread out my navigation here a little bit to make sure that those using their finger instead of a mouse, something less precise, can navigate my site. So I want to think about where this site will usually be viewed as far as hardware goes. I can then scrub on in here and make sure that at the smallest part of this breakpoint, things don't break. So notice as I get towards the other end here, it's uncomfortably crowded for me. So I'm going to kind of jump back to that breakpoint and I'll pull things back just a little bit. I like it a little broader. I can even move out the content a little further to the left and right if I wanted. But now that I've kind of tested one extreme, I'm going to drag. I wish we had a automatic way to go to the smallest part of a breakpoint. We kind of don't have a keyboard command for that. But things are looking good now in the smallest instance of this breakpoint until I jump to the phone layout where I've just basically decided to center the content because it is on a phone, which is much smaller. I could even go so far as to increase a little bit the space between those navigation elements to make sure that on that phone device you can still click through. So when I set these up, I'm thinking really about my navigation in the header and the footer. I'm not thinking about the page content. If I switch back now towards my site plan and come into the menu page, I want to think about my page content. Now, as I put that content into place, I'll start to see how things get crowded. You and I both have agreed here, right, that as I'm working, there comes a time where three-column structure just does not work all that well. And if I look at the template design, I'm going to just keep dragging until I see that break occur. I'm going to look up here at about 886. I would argue about 900 pixels, or maybe not. Let's see. Looks like 880 pixels. It goes from a three-column structure to a two-column structure. We're going to do that in a minute. Let's get our header image in there, and then we're going to jump into the next bit. So my point on the breakpoints here is as I'm designing on an individual page and adding content, I'm going to start usually with the largest breakpoint, because it usually has the majority of my information. If I'm going to reduce some information for something like a smartphone, it'll usually be less stuff than the desktop version. So I tend to start with the most information at desktop, and then as I get smaller, decide if I'm going to hide content or change its formatting to adjust for the smaller devices. So for that header area here, I'm going to swing back into Muse, and I just want to place that in the header. So I'll pull down on File to place the image. Now, to be honest, I'm not going to do that, and we can quickly talk about why. So if I come in and grab that image here, let's navigate to my starter designs real quick here. And I can grab any of these background images, let's say background 4. And I'm just going to kind of click and release it on the page. It's very large. That's placed at actual size. So that was a little too much. I'm going to undo that. And this time I'll press and drag to place it on the canvas. And once I've done that in a very InDesign-like way, I can use certain keyboard commands like the Alt key here, or the Option key. Let's try that again. Command key. And I can actually trim down the size of my object to be more like a header, and I could resize it to work with it. But the truth is, this is just a placed image, and it doesn't give me the ability to kind of scale to fill my content as my browser size changes. So let's kind of show that off just for a second. I've got this first instance. What I want to do the second time is come in and create kind of a comparable rectangle. And in sort of a lazy way here, I'm going to come in and right-click to copy this image. So I'm going to come in and copy it onto the clipboard. And then I'll go to that container. And instead of really placing it on the design canvas, I'm going to right-click and I'm going to paste as a background image. Unless it won't let me. Let me try this again. Probably helps if I grab the right kind of container. So I'm going to grab the one that has the X's here, basically, the rectangle tool, rather than just a rectangle, right? What's the difference here? Silly Dan. Rectangle frame. So I want to be able to fill that content. So now that I've got the right type of rectangle, I can right-click and I can say paste as a background image. That is funny. Let's try this again. Let me go and grab that image. This is called Demo Gods Playing With Me. And I'm going to cut it onto the clipboard, come to this guy, and paste his background image. So I probably didn't have it on the clipboard for real there because it didn't see it as something that could be pasted as a background. I'll go ahead and do that. So paste as background. All right, well, that's nice. I have the background image there, but it's not really fitting the container. With the object still selected, notice this is another big sort of subtle aspect of Muse. Keep an eye on what we call a control panel up here at the top, because we're very selection state specific around what we expose here. Notice that I've got the image frame selected, and I can see that in the upper left-hand corner. The other big epiphany here is anything that's kind of dotted and orange usually has a lot more details that you can expose. So with that object selected, and I can see it selected there on the left, when I click on Fill, I can go in and define how that image fills a container. And I want to scale to fill so that no matter what that container size is, it's going to have the content fill appropriately. So just to show the difference here real quickly, I've got the first content which has been set to resize height and width. The second one has that scale to fill behavior defined, and it will also resize height and width. Let's take a look at the difference here in the browser. So I'm using a keyboard command to replicate pulling down on File, Preview, Page in Browser. Muse is going to generate all of the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and put it onto a page for me. This is just running on my own machine, but I can start to see the difference in the behavior here. Doesn't look very different at all, right? We're kind of using two different approaches for the different images here. If I come into this object now and set it to scale to fill the width of the container. So if I come on in and drag this guy to one end and press and drag it to another, and I then go ahead and take a look at my scale to fill behavior, Notice that this is now starting to span the full width of the browser when I get to that individual breakpoint. So that's more of the behavior that I'd like. I'm going to delete that first instance. I'll come on up and just press and drag this guy into place. Now notice that I've placed a container on the canvas, and I've set it to resize, basically. Let's try to change this a little bit. I'm giving myself my own conniptions here. Let's try this all over again, guys. I'm going to use the rectangle tool. And with that now there, I'm going to paste as a background image that object. And then I'm going to set it to be stretch browser width. So by using that first rectangle, this has kind of set me off on the wrong path. The rectangle tool, I can define it as a full browser width object. I can also determine how it resizes here. Notice it's set to original size. I'll set it to scale to fill. And I can also define the point from which that scaling behavior happens. So although I've confused many of you in this live demo, what I would argue is as you work with images, play with some of the resizing attributes and also play with containers on the canvas and the resize behaviors you can have here. So I have this image now finally defined the right way, and I'm going to press and drag it into position here. And notice that my Kava logo is going away. I really don't want that to happen. So what I want to do with this object is right-click on it, and I can go to the layer details. So move to layer. I don't want it on the top layer. Remember how we have a hierarchical structure set? I'm going to bring it to the page layer. And now when I press and drag it, it's doing a really nice magical thing. That gray box is part of the footer part, just as a point of reference for me. The image is now behind the top nav attributes, and I've got my logo and such sitting on top of that. I'm going to show you one more trick. The oh so forever trending parallax scrolling effect can be achieved with this image if I'd like. So with this object still selected, I'm going to go to that magical fill drop-down area, and I'm going to click on scroll. Unless I'm going to just get in my own way left and right today. We're going to leave that alone for now. Sorry. I can define background scroll attributes. What I would need to do is set this to be a fixed breakpoint, just slightly larger, which is probably beyond our Muse 101. But there are ways that you can apply a parallax scroll effects to a background image. Remember we said we were going to slow down and call this Muse 101. That's advice for myself as well as for all of you. All right, I've got my image set, and I've got it in my header area. And if I come in and kind of preview where I'm at, once again, so hitting the keyboard command or pulling down on File to preview the page in the browser, I can start to see where we're at. So we're in pretty good shape. Notice my reservation, my navigation is sticking all the way to the left there. And I kind of don't want that to happen. So let's find a way to keep this from moving quite as much. In my 1200 pixel breakpoint here, it's set to be a fluid breakpoint. And I've got my navigation that's sitting there. Let's kind of debug that a bit. I'm going to go back out and look at my master page for that largest breakpoint and see I've got some funky stuff going on here. I'm going to bring this guy in. I'll make sure it kind of centers with my logo. So I'll wait till I get that center indicator. A bit tricky there. The next thing I want to do is tell it that no matter how wide the browser is, I want my navigation to stay on the right-hand side. So there's a couple ways that you can define pinning behavior here within Muse. I've got what's known as browser level pinning, and that's a rule that says that no matter how big the browser is, it's going to stay not only centered horizontally, but vertically as well. It's going to stay right in the upper corner. For this design, I want everything to move off screen, but I do want to define a fixed width from the right. So I'm not going to use browser level pinning. I'm going to actually come on in. I keep getting caught up in a screen sharing thing I'm doing here. Come on. I want to, instead of pinning to the upper corner of the browser, I want to pin to the right-hand side, this navigation here. And then I'll switch back over to my site plan, swing back into that particular page, and just refresh my preview once again. Now that I've defined a fixed distance from the right-hand side here, notice as I press and drag up until my largest breakpoint. So to when I get to 1200 pixels, it's going to stay in a fixed width from the side. If I drag further beyond 1200, notice that it stays to the center. I personally like this because if someone loads this up on a huge monitor, a 50-inch monitor, I don't really want the navigation so far off on the side that you can't even see it in sight. You do have the ability to control that, though, by changing this funny little arrow here. So if I change that to, say, infinite width, basically, so if I just make that one change, I can choose to make it such that that navigation always stays to the right, no matter how infinitely wide the browser width is. All right, I'm going to pause and check a couple questions that are going on here. All right, we have a question. Oh, good. We have a big thumbs up, which I always like. And I'm going to go ahead and check on Facebook a little bit and see how folks are doing. Okay, looks like folks are talking to themselves. All right, good. Happy people. That's what happens when you talk to yourself in a room. Okay, so we got the header content set. I'm going to try to stay mainstream. I'd love to show you the scroll effects on here, but all right, you twisted my arm. I'm going to come in a little bit here. I'm going to add another breakpoint. So to do that, I'm going to right click. I'm going to come on in and say add breakpoint. I might get into trouble here because I'm going off script. I'm going to set that breakpoint at slightly larger than the one that's already there. So let's say I set this to 1300 pixels in width. And then in the drop down, instead of selecting fluid width, I'm going to say fixed width. Like I said, this might break things. I usually don't do this, but let's try it. Fixed width, click OK. All right, that worked all right. So if I come in closer here to look at my breakpoint bar, notice that there's a different kind of icon. That indicates a fixed width breakpoint. This one indicates a fluid width breakpoint. Now that I dropped one just outside 1200, what I can do is tell this breakpoint, when I select on that background image, that I want this to use that cool parallax effect. So with the container selected, under fill, I can now click on scroll and define a scroll motion that basically says, this is where I have to think for a minute, I want it to move at 0.8 times the speed of scroll, not do anything horizontally, and this should start officially at 0, so the very top of my browser, again 0.8 and 0. So you can read about this in some tutorials if I've totally lost you there. But if the gods of demoing want to now cooperate with me, we'll have kind of a cool effect that I've added in a larger breakpoint. So back in the smaller breakpoints, as this page loads up, we've got the behavior that we set. If I now come into this page, as I press and drag, everything's kind of good. I need to get content down here on the bottom probably to show this a little better. But as I grow outside of that 1200 pixel space, we're going to get some kind of fun magic going on. So let me swing back here. This is what happens when you go off script. I'm just going to put something on the page. So press and drag and get this guy just a little lower. I want my page to scroll, and I need some content to do that. So it doesn't really matter what this container element is for the moment. It's just going to allow me to prove my point. So now that I have more content on the page, I can scroll down on that page and see the kind of magic that we've got going on. You'll see this as we add more content. But if I come back to the smaller breakpoints that have that fluid width behavior, the image just moves off screen. If I go out past the 1200 pixel mark, it's doing that cool parallax scroll effect. All right, that satisfies me. I don't know if I confused you along the way, but we'll talk about that more as we populate more content. All right, we've got some of the basics set now. So I've got a fixed breakpoint at 1300. I'm going to get rid of it because it's going to make things complicated. We can go back to that a little later on. But let's stick with the 1200 pixel area now. And we want to start dealing with some text elements. As I mentioned, I'm going to be a bit lazy about this. Let's see what I have in my Creative Cloud library folder. I think I have some library items that I have used in the past. Obviously, I have many items. I can use other approaches here, but let's see, what's this guy? Not that one. All right, we're going to take a different approach. Too much stuff, says Dani. I'm just going to open up a finished version of the site, and I'm going to borrow some pieces. We'll go to Kava, and we're going to go to a more finished version just to steal some of the text. This one will do. I'm going to come into the menu area here. I'm going to steal some of that nice text elements. All right, I'm just going to kind of grab these guys a little bit. In fact, I'm going to try to be as transparent as possible. I'm just going to grab two of them. So the headline and the text here. And I'm going to go ahead and copy those. And let's come over to our new page. So here on the page, I'm going to go ahead and paste. Just paste those two elements. Notice I've got three choices here. It's pretty interesting. The place that I copied that from, the finished Kava example, it has text, and those text elements have been laid out for multiple breakpoints. I just want to start with the raw container because I want to show you how you can lay out the breakpoints. If I wanted to, though, I could paste it and paste over any breakpoints I might have defined that are associated with that element. This is a really powerful feature when you start doing a lot of productivity production work with Muse. I'm going to go ahead and select paste, just kind of paste it on the canvas because we're doing things really simply. And now I just have some simple text that at my largest breakpoint, I'm going to come on in and just center here on the page. And I can make this container larger if I like. It's a very small bit of text. So if this were a large headline, I might want this content to actually resize or the container to flow. Because it's small, I don't need to do that. So as I place each element on the canvas, I'm starting to think about the responsive behavior for that element. So the word drink, even on a phone, is going to be small enough that I don't need it to flow or resize, let's say, an actual word, drink. So with it selected, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that it's set to not resize in width. That's not necessary. This is true for icons, a lot of size. Absolutely for buttons. I hate when buttons resize. I think a button should be fixed in height and width across all breakpoints, personally. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that's set to none. And you'll notice that it's also pinned to the center of the page for its responsive behavior. So that's good. I'll leave that as it is. I have another element here, and it's got just a few things going on. It's a text element. It's got a very slight fill. There is text pieces that are here. If I escape out, notice it's just a text frame with the elements defined. Now, there are different ways you can do what's known as card design. Sometimes you can set cards that, so if you think of things like Pinterest pages, where you have these repeated cards. One method of responsive design is to say that the width of that card really never changes. It just gets crowded and it starts to move down and stack on itself. If you remember, the approach that I used for this design was to have it be fluid in width until it gets crowded. So I'm going to actually allow this to be a resizable element, and we'll just use one to show off our concept here. I'll start with one in the center. And it's set by default, since I copied it from that source application, to resize in its width. We'll leave it that way. I'm going to go ahead and use Shift and Option and just press and drag a second instance on the canvas. And I'll give myself a reasonable amount of space for this 1200 pixel element. And we're just going to let the text stay the same for now. Notice that Muse gives me some guides that let me know when I'm at about the same width distance for the two elements I'm adding. But by holding Shift and Command, I can duplicate as I drag. And all three have that fluid width behavior set. Now, in the spirit of kind of just wireframing this out quickly, I'll go ahead and build out a second group or set here for the second bit of text. Again, it's a little hard because it's gray on white, but they're all pretty well defined. Now, I can do some testing, some previewing of behavior on the design canvas. In general, I never use preview here. I find it to be not as reliable as previewing in an actual browser because I can have things like my previous and next buttons. I can navigate between pages in a real browser. It's a little odd to do it in the app. I kind of never use that one. But I can now come in and see how these objects are going to behave, even though I'm still here on the design canvas. And the way I'll do that is using this breakpoint bar, and I'm going to press and drag to resize my page. Now, many of you that have started working with responsive design have noticed that Muse gets kind of sluggish. The more breakpoints you add, the more elements you add on the page. It's just kind of the truthful truth. There's a lot of logic that needs to take place as Muse looks at all of these elements and reflects how it's going to behave in the browser. So quite often, scrubbing on the design canvas is a good way to get started and get a sense of how things are going to work. What I want to do is keep an eye on my design elements, and when my design is about to break, you know the answer, we're going to add a breakpoint. So I'm going to come on in and select that breakpoint bar and just keep an eye on everything. I'm looking at my navigation up at the top, I'm looking at the image in the background, and I'm looking at the space between elements. That looks like about a good spot. I'll go a little bit further, and then I'm just personally going to jump to 2-column. I'm not going to stay with 3-column for much longer. So when I get to the point where I feel like things are kind of pushing it, that they're a little crowded, I'm going to stop dragging my breakpoint bar, and you'll notice here in the bar I have a plus sign that allows me to add a new breakpoint. So I'll go ahead and click and release to add a new breakpoint. Notice it's almost where the tablet navigation is, but it doesn't have to be the exact same place. I'm putting my breakpoint where my design breaks, not necessarily where a tablet picks up, okay? So the next thing I want to do is kind of come in and change this to a 2-column design. And there's some tricks for just moving things around quickly in this way. I'm going to come in and select all the content that I have here. And if you'll notice here, there's different control symbols here for these elements. I have a group of individual elements. They all have handles to resize them, the squares. But notice that kind of the whole group together has diamonds. What I want to do is come in and resize these elements. I'm going to press and drag from the diamond position until things start to look like a good 2-column structure. Now, I definitely get off easy here because this is more of a wireframe prototype rather than actual text. But once I've done that, I can come in now and select the 2 that have sort of fallen off the page, and I'm going to put those into position, again using these guides to kind of check my spacing as I work. There is an align panel, and it's kind of what you would expect from Illustrator or InDesign that allows me to easily align these elements if things go a little awry. But I've now kind of bought myself some space here. I'll hit the space bar and resize my page here on the design canvas, and I can again start to look at how my design will look. So if I go out to the largest breakpoint, press and drag, world's pretty good, it gets a little crowded, I jump to my next breakpoint, and I'll probably come in and do that one more time. Things are looking uncomfortably crowded at this point, drop another breakpoint, once again come into these elements, and I'm going to press and drag. Now, notice that the space between these 2 columns is getting awfully big. There's different ways you can press and drag, not to make life too complicated. And I always forget a little bit here, but if I hit Option, Shift, let's say, notice I can control the space between the objects. What I'm going to do is go ahead and drag out to where I kind of like the way things are looking. And then I'm going to go back to that Shift Option and move them a little closer. Now I'm about to go single column, so that little trick doesn't matter as much. But I'll get to where I can comfortably grow this container without it being too odd. Let's say about there. I'll zoom out a bit, grab this other 3 columns, bring them all in line using those same alignment guides. And then I'm going to select everybody on the page here. And let's take the more brute force approach. I'm going to bring up the Align panel. So under Window, I'll select Align. And I'll just align them to center. Now, an important point is on the first 2 breakpoints with that text, they were kind of on the left and right, and they were fluidly resizing in what's known as percentage-based pinning, right? So they were in relationship to the overall width of the browser, adjusting. Because everything is in a single column here, I want to make sure that I pin it to the center. It's going to make my life easier. So with them all selected, I'm going to come to the control panel for pinning, and center pin those objects. Let's see if it wants to listen to me. I may have mixed use here a bit. So let's make sure the text is center pinned, and then this columns of elements are also center pinned. I can give myself a little padding here as well. There's not a really elegant way to do that, but I want to make sure that this is not so close to the bottom of the page. So I'm just going to draw a rectangle there and have that create some padding for me. Now I want that on my phone layout. Let's keep an eye on that padding. Notice this is another lovely trick. When you have an object selected on the canvas, you can click between breakpoints. The selection state will continue, which is really nice. So if I jump to the next largest breakpoint, I can see where it is. I could either hide it from this breakpoint or just move it up to something a little more appropriate. Another real trick is when you have an object selected and you want to jump to a breakpoint, if you hit Shift-Command-6, it's going to take you to the next largest breakpoint while keeping everything selected. If you hit Shift-Command-5, it's going to take you to a smaller one. So Shift-Command-5 takes me to that phone layout. Shift-Command-6, I jump to tablet. One more time to more of the desktop layout where I can, with that object still selected, kind of move it up into place. All right, we're going to take a look at this and I'm going to pause for questions. So preview it in browser and let's see how everything is all coming together for me here. So in this instance, it's rendering not only a page, but pretty much 3 pages in the browser. So I've got that largest breakpoint. Everything's just going to grow forever because I have that outward arrow still selected. Press and drag when things get a bit crowded. Boom, they jump to 2 column. I don't like the gap there. I'd probably loosen it up or tighten it up a bit, but boom, I get to the smallest breakpoint until I get to that minimum size, and the world's all good. All right, that was kind of a real lot to handle, but time is ticking. Let's go ahead and take a look at any questions that have come up as we're working here. Looks like you're just a really captive audience and everything is good. I'm going to keep going. Let's go back to our goal and see what other interesting elements we can introduce here. Because some of what I've just shown you about images and text are going to apply across the board. I do know a good one that I want to talk to you about next, so I know where I'm going to go. But we've got this menu page pretty well set. We haven't really populated our footer elements out, but we could do that pretty easily. We can jump to the next page, which has text in it, but it also has a widget, and that is a mapping widget. You can kind of jump on that a little bit, but I'm a little concerned about time. So let me just show you how the map widget behaves on that new page. We'll get started with it, and then I want to talk to you about another concept. So I'm going to jump on over to my site plan, and we could do this one of a few ways. If I go into the location area, and I know I want to introduce a map, what I would do is go to the Widget Library. Now the Widget Library has a couple different things going on. This is the stock widgets that come from the Muse team when you install Muse. And there are a number of different components that are here. I can go to the it's kind of interesting. What have I done to myself here? Under social, I'm going to grab the Google Map widget, and I'm going to drag that onto the canvas. Notice that when I drag it on the canvas, it does this kind of spinning pizza wheel of death. What's happening is widgets quite often are pulling data from the web. We want to show you the data that would be generated from that widget. So for a moment, when you place a widget on the canvas for Muse here, only for actually a fraction of time, we're going to come in and try to render the content of a widget on the design canvas. If we can't get enough data, and there's good reasons for that sometimes, we'll just stop trying to render, but we do try to reflect what the web is going to give you when it comes to a widget. So I've got a mapping widget here, and in the flyout, I might decide I want to do Adobe Seattle for a location, and I might want to change the zoom level to be something much closer, a zoom level of 9. Notice that as I'm doing that, it's real-time adjusting appropriately. Now that I've done it, I can define the behavior of this element. So if I want to simulate the finished design, it's more of a map like this inside a container. And I'll make sure that it is set with fluid responsive width so that it's going to resize as elements come and go. And that's an example of a widget. If you do not see a widget that you want, let's say you want an audio widget. Let's say you want a widget that allows you to put your Shopify store on your page. There are over, by last count, about 1,500 widgets that are part of something known as the Muse Widget Directory. This is a community-driven area. I am responsible for it. I work with widget developers. I onboard their descriptions into the widget directory, but they're independent sellers of their widgets. Some are free, some cost money, some require a membership, but it's a wealth of opportunity for you to expand the native Muse application to all the ways that the web continues to evolve. So if I want to add widgets from the community, instead of going to the widget library, I'm just going to go to the library. We have 3 libraries, not widget library, not CC library, but under window here, if I go to the library panel, sorry, that's called Beautiful Legacy. If you're new to Muse, your library is going to be empty, but you'll see there's a link here at the top. Find more library items online. If you click that, it will take you to the widget directory. Maybe. And in there, you can come in and just, if you want to experiment, start with the free stuff. Look at what's freely delivered from the community. But there's all sorts of categories of ways that you can extend your Muse application using widgets. So they're really powerful. I encourage you to experiment a little bit there. The other thing I do want to show you is, let me just grab this map, and I'm going to copy it to the clipboard. And we're going to come on into this menu page. I'm just going to do kind of a terrible mashup here because I don't think we have enough time to get much more into detail. But let me paste that map onto the page. And I just want to show you a little bit about how you can control your design. Let's say I think that for some reason I can't even make up right now, I really want to have a map here on my desktop layout of my menu, because that makes immense sense, doesn't it? But with it here, I like having it there. But if I were to jump to, let's say, the next breakpoint, I'm going to kind of let it reduce here and move it down. Let's say when I get to the smallest breakpoint that I've defined, I really don't want the map to be there. This could be because it's actually just something that I don't want to have on a particular layout. So rather than putting a map here, I might have a button that says get driving directions. And I want users to be able to go off to the Google driving application rather than view it on screen. See, I came up with a really good use case. So rather than showing the full map, I want to do something different. I want to come on in and let them go get their own driving directions. So watch how clever this is, or not. Let me just see what I can pull off here real quick. If I preview this on the page, I've got my little map here. And let's say I want directions. I click that link and it takes me to Google driving directions. Now, if I'm on my phone, I don't want to see the driving directions in my little website. I want to actually jump out to my Google Maps application. So watch this trick. I'm going to come on in and grab this URL. I'm going to copy it on the clipboard. And I'm going to go back to my app, and I'm going to decide that in the smallest breakpoint, on those smallest devices, I don't want the full-on map. I'm going to right-click here on this object, and I'm going to select Hide in Breakpoint. This allows me to say that for this particular breakpoint, I want to show different content. I'm going to hide the full-on map, and I'm going to be extraordinarily lazy here if this works. I'm going to drag another copy of this text that I got going on in the spirit of speed. Actually, let's just do it this way. I'm going to steal the headline that says drink, and I'll press and drag a second copy down here. This is just like the crescendo of this demo. You ready, folks? If I do this right. Instead of drink, I'm going to say get driving directions. Very nasty big headline for my mobile device. And I'll even drag the container a little larger so I get a little more space. So now I want to get driving directions. Now, keep in mind, on my phone layout here, I added some text, get driving directions. If I jump to the tablet layout, I have the map, and I've got that silly get driving directions text in the wrong place. I don't want that to show up on tablet or desktop. I just want it on the phone layout. So going back here to where I added that text, I'm going to right click, and instead of hiding it in the current breakpoint, I'm going to hide it in all the other breakpoints, right? With that now selected, I want to make this kind of a hyperlink, a button. So in the hyperlinks dropdown, I'm going to go on in and I'm just going to paste in that exact URL for driving directions. And I'm going to go to the hyperlinks area, that powerful orange dropdown. I'm going to say, go ahead and open the link in a new window or tab. All right. Having done that, let's take a look at what we did. So I'm going to preview the page in the browser. I've got my lovely menu, which makes a lot of sense, a whole lot of flat white coffee. And I have a map. As I press and drag, the map is brilliantly resizing. And there's my map again. I'm going to press and drag until I get to the phone layout. And you know what? Rather than, that's interesting, why aren't you linking for me here? Let's check that again. Rather than show the map, so much for my crescendo. So I'm going to select this guy again and make sure that I really paste in that URL and hit return. That's there. Open a new browser. I'm going to click off, click back again, make sure it's still there. Preview it in the browser one more time for our crescendo. Scroll on down. So we go from the actual map to the smallest breakpoint where I have a link, right? See how as I roll over this, I could put a hyperlink underline if I wanted, but when I click the link on a particular device, it will bring up Google driving directions for me, which is probably more appropriate for a mobile device. So sort of in summary there, what we talked about is a lot of stuff, but most recently, how you can hide and show elements per breakpoint to accommodate the content appropriately for either the device or the browser width. The ways this come into play. Let's say you have some beautiful photography and you don't mind them loading in a very, very high resolution. And there are ways that Muse controls the size of an image when it's placed on the canvas. But there's also ways that you can kind of override that and have really high quality images. That may be appropriate for a photo website on desktop. But on a phone layout, you may want it to be a much smaller image or a different image. You can control that absolutely. You can also hide and show content. A lot of times when I'm doing a website and you get to the mobile layout, it's inappropriate to see a form where you fill out details on your phone. You can just put text that says, by the way, go ahead and load this site on a tablet or a desktop device to actually fill in the contact form. So you can change that text based on the width of the browser. You know what I'm going to say, which is you have now spent yet another hour of your copious free time with me. Pablo realized that I lost the text box, which is probably why I had trouble earlier on. But that is kind of just the basics for Muse. I hope this is the beginning of an experience that you enjoy with the tool. If you want to learn more, hang out at muse.adobe.com. That's the best place. Any upcoming sessions, presentations that we have, you can see them on the events tab. There are lots of tutorials that are short videos. Events will also take you to all of the longer YouTube recordings that were originally on Facebook Live but are in that archive. Widgets we already talked about. Site of the Day is a really beautiful showcase each week usually. I took this past week off. We showcase sites from the community, and we've had sites there from when Muse was in beta. There's hundreds and hundreds of websites built in Muse. And the resources tab tell you more about people that build out templates, starter designs, and widgets in the community. Also as well some learning techniques, some learning training tutorials and such. So thank you for your time. I'll see you again in about 2 weeks. If you have topics you'd like to see cover, you're welcome to throw them into the comments field here on Facebook Live, and I'll take a look before we figure out what we're going to talk about in 2 weeks. Thank you everyone for your time, and I hope to see you again soon.